I'm Steve Henriksen. I'm curator of collections at the Alaska State Museum, and I'm co-presenting today with Richard Vanderhoek from the Department of Natural Resource Office of History and Archaeology. He's the state archaeologist based in Anchorage. And I first and foremost would like to thank the Okwan, whose land we are happily using today for this wonderful conference. And I just wanted to mention that the land that we're hovering over now under about 20 feet of AJ mine fill is on top of the beach that was on the in front of the Auk village back at the base of the hill originally, and sometime in the middle 20th century that was all filled in, and that resulted in this flat bit of land that Centennial Hall and the State Museum and this building are sitting on. And when we were building our new museum facility next door, we discovered that the tide still flows under this land up to the ancient beach in front of the Okwan village. And I always thought of it as being like the heartbeat of the Auk people is still coming and going underneath our feet invisibly in some ways, but the tide still percolates through all that fill right up to the original beach. So I like to, when I'm down in this part of town, I like to think about how that still happens under our feet. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rich, who will start out our presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Our presentation is in parts. This presentation is based on the fact that several years ago, the Smithsonian 3D scanned and printed 2 Tlingit throwing boards and presented the opportunity for people to actually physically handle what was an exact copy of the original and actually try it. And so this talk is based on background on the spear thrower, the throwing board use in the Arctic, the actual historic examples of the Tlingit Shee around the world, and then looking at the potential functional abilities of the Shee and the use of throwing boards for public outreach and actually better understanding the past. So, okay, so it's not that one? All right. Basically, a spear thrower, or atlatl as it's often called in the Americas, or a throwing board as it's usually called in the Arctic, is basically just a lever that lengthens your wrist. And it propels a spear thrown by a spear thrower we call a dart. It propels a dart faster than you could throw it by hand. These are series of images that were scanned decades ago, and if you watch the throw, this is not somebody hunting, not an accuracy throw, but a kind of a heave throw for distance. That's what it looks like. You'll notice that the spear compresses and is pushed off the spear thrower. One thing this highlights is that your spear has to bend. If your spear does not bend, your spear does not fly right. I probably shouldn't plug this here, but we have a hands-on demo to use the spear thrower and printed Tlingit Shee this afternoon at 3:30 and tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 behind the Tlingit Haida building. Okay. The spear thrower as a tool goes back tens of thousands of years. We know that it was used for sure back in during the last ice age. We have rock art or painted images in caves in Europe. This one shows an eviscerated bison with a a bird-headed man laying down, a variety of other things going on. But the important thing is there's this stick at the bottom with a cross piece tied onto it. This image shows up in other Upper Paleolithic rock art. We know they were using the spear thrower. The spear thrower is used in a variety of places in the world, commonly imaged in Australia. Many names for the spear thrower there. The one that's been most commonly used is Woomera. In Australia, they actually have a Woomera rocket range named after this tool. The advantage of the spear thrower is it lets you throw a spear harder, faster, and farther than one can throw by hand. That's really important if you're hunting large, dangerous game. We know that people hunted mammoth and mastodon in the Old and New World with this technology. The evidence we have suggests that people were using the spear thrower when they came into the Americas the first time. About 5 years ago in central Alaska, an archaeological discovery was made where these 4 antler rods, these are elk antler, were found in an archaeological site, and out on the ends of them were those 2 stone points. Those stone points were found in association enough that it looks like they were probably tied on before they went in. Sorry. This is important because if you're familiar with what a standard dart looks like, you've got a point, a wood foreshaft, possibly, and then a long main shaft out of wood. If you were to replace that wood with antler, you have a much heavier and really more fearsome tool as far as how that dart would penetrate. So this is sort of like finding in an archaeological site a 375 H&H or maybe 458 Magnum casing in there. It's like, this is obvious that they were hunting big game. And then from the fauna on the site, we know people were hunting bison in central Alaska at this time, 11,500 years ago. So we get a better picture of how they were hunting with this technology. We know by 8,000 years ago, we see evidence in dry caves in the Southwest, in Great Basin. This complete spear thrower is found there. That bulbous thing on the bottom is a stone. If you put a weight on a spear thrower, particularly if you're using really long darts, it helps to counterbalance it. And having a fairly heavy spear thrower counteracts some of the bobbles that a person has when they throw. Southwest US, we know that people were using spear throwers because we see it in their rock art. At the very top in the circle is a basket maker atlatl. This is from Valley of Fire State Park. And then in the last 20 years, the discovery's been made that both caribou hang out on snow patches in the summertime. Well, that's been known for thousands of years. The discovery that was made was that people were up there hunting them and occasionally losing their tools. The reason this is cool is because that frozen snow patch ends up preserving these tools. So, you know, stone points you find in archaeological sites. The shaft that's hafted on that stone point and the sinew that ties it on, and sometimes the fletching out on the end, that's never preserved. So here we have that whole technology preserved that we can look at. Looking at the archaeological record, we see that the atlatl and dart transitioned to the bow and arrow in the Yukon between about 1,250 and 1,200 years ago. This ties right in with when the White River ash erupted across the area. So what it looks like is that the caribou left the region, people left the region, and when people come back in, they were carrying the bow. kind of a hard to read map. Basically, this shows that the bow and arrow moved into the Arctic around 5,000 years ago. It moved across the Arctic out on the Aleutians, but for some unknown reason, it doesn't seem to move down the west coast and down through the rest of the Americas till sometime around or before 1,500 years ago. So that's when the bow moves in. The bow takes over, the bow and arrow takes over for the spear thrower and spear for hunting terrestrial mammals. But across the Arctic, the spear thrower, or now when we're talking about hunting marine mammals, we'll call it a throwing board. The throwing board still holds pride of place for hunting marine mammals. We'll talk about why. Here's a picture of a Anungan or Aleut hunter with his suite of tools. You'll see that in the kind of middle right there, he's got a bow and arrow, but he also maintains a spear thrower and several kinds of darts that are thrown with it, both for sea mammal hunting and for birds. This image on the upper left, you have a Sukpiak spear thrower, lower right, Anungan or Aleut, and in the middle, a better close-up of what a marine mammal or seal dart looks like and a bird dart looks like. So why, if Arctic societies had the bow and arrow, why did they continue to use this technology? Well, to start with, the throwing board can better propel a heavy dart than an arrow can. You can have a fairly heavy arrow, and people did hunt marine mammals with seal arrows, but the dart can be propelled by a throwing board. That can be propelled by a throwing board is much heavier. And there's times that that's what you want. Also, if you're in a kayak, it's useful. A throwing board can be used one-handed. If you're marine mammal hunting, you're out in a wet environment. If your bowstring is either made out of sinew or rawhide, there's a potential moisture problem. So all these things make a throwing board a handier tool in a marine environment. And some people actually kind of consider the throwing board and dart part of the whole kayak complex. So why are they using this? Is it because it's great killing power? No, it's a tool that ties the sea mammal to the surface so it can then be recovered. The sea mammal can operate in 3 dimensions. Us air breathers are just kind of tied to the top. So this really nice example of this dart here. Out on the end of the dart, you'll see a barbed point that fits snugly into a socket in the end. There's a line that ties to that. It wraps around the dart. At a certain point, that line splits and ties to the top and bottom of the dart. When the dart is thrown, it injects this point into the sea mammal. You're either using a barbed point or a toggling point. Either way, they go in, they catch on the hide, and the line unravels on the dart. And as you probably saw, the dart's fairly long. It has a heavy socket piece on one end that causes it to inject that point into the animal. It also causes the dart to float vertically through the water, and you've got this flag following the sea mammal around. And you're tied just to however the length of that line is, so that sea mammal has to stay within that vicinity. At that point, he can be captured and killed. And interestingly enough, there's a location in Alaska that they're still using the throwing board and dart. The reason being is that there's a couple things going on there that makes rifle hunting not work. The lower 4 villages on the Yukon River and the Yukon River Delta still make the first strike on seals with a throwing board and dart. Two reasons. One, it's brackish water, it's so fresh water out there. The seal does not float very high, and it's muddy. So if that seal is shot and it drops below the surface, it's virtually unrecoverable. So you're still seeing the throwing board and dart use down there. Now, they're not hunting from kayak, they're hunting from Boston whalers and other things, but it's still in use. This whole project was started because of the Tlingit throwing boards that were scanned and printed in 2017. These are the originals, 4 views of the original, the one board, the second board. They're scanned, they're made out of this plastic substance. The folks then stain them. And by the way, there should be a throwing board circulating around there. If you haven't seen it, okay, it's right there. So that action, having those throwing boards available, is what sparked this whole project. My interest, my background is in the function of this tool. Steve's is in the shape, the history, and the presence of them in the world today. So I'm going to turn that part over to Steve to cover.
Well, thanks, Rich. What I wanted to start with was just tell you a little bit about my interest in throwing boards and why this project has been so interesting to me, because it involves some mysteries surrounding these throwing boards. It's very ancient technology, and certainly among the Tlingit, the last recorded, actually the only recorded use of the throwing board among the Tlingit is from the late 1700s. A British fur trader who was visiting Sitka in 1788 actually saw one of these throwing boards in use, and I wanted to quote Andrew Taylor was the journalist here. Quote, "They heave the spears with a short piece of wood with a hole in its end, which receives the inner end of the spear while supporting it with the left hand. Thrusting their spear from them, this short machine with great ease and dexterity with the right hand, and sends it with greater force than if it were grasped and thrown by the hands only. We observed them kill one otter in the canoe. They kept themselves snug in the canoe. The man who was going to strike barely showed his head over the gunwale of the canoe when the otter was near enough to be struck, and he was killed with ease." So this gives us an eyewitness account of people actually using those boards for hunting. But for a long time in the art history, among the art history people, it was assumed that these boards were not meant to be functional. And one of the reasons is because they're short compared to other boards used in Alaska and North America, which are maybe 5 inches or so longer and would give greater leverage and speed and distance when you're throwing a dart with them. And the shortness plus the elaborate decoration on these Tlingit boards, they're all carved with very elaborate 2- and 3-dimensional carvings of different animals. They felt that this was more probably a shaman's tool rather than something that's actually used for hunting. And that sometimes the creatures depicted on the board are creatures that are associated with shamans, like maybe oyster catchers, land otters, things like that, rather than crest images that you would maybe expect if it was a hunting tool. So part of our project has been to look at what the evidence is for supporting these as shaman's tools versus their possible use for actually hunting. And we already started out by finding this early eyewitness account of a board actually being used. So I wanted to go through and look at a few other slides. Some of our research has been comparing the Tlingit throwing boards with other Alaska Native groups, and there are some similarities, but it may be that the Tlingit have a particular environmental zone that they're using these in, because of course they used bows and arrows for hunting seals and sea otters for many years, and so they were certainly able to use bows for hunting, but there may have been certain circumstances when a throwing board was better. The level of decoration on the Tlingit boards is pretty exceptional, and you've seen the print with all the different carved figures on it. The only other Alaska Native group that I know of that decorated their throwing boards were the Alutiiq and Sugpiaq people, and there's a board there that has a very minimalistic depiction of a sea otter limbs on it. So they had a tradition of carving hunting tools and the hunter's own clothing and accessories in a way that would please the spirits of the animals being hunted, and also to give protection to the hunter, because these were very dangerous enterprises when you're going whaling from a kayak. It's a very dangerous thing, and in fact, anytime you're hunting from a small canoe or kayak, it's a life and death situation, and you need spiritual assistance for that. So some of the carvings that we see on the Tlingit boards may be to provide the hunter with safety and luck when they're out hunting. And among the Aleut people, the throwing board and the dart is really a figure conceived of as an extension of a hunting machine that consists of the kayak and all the gear used in the kayak, and so the person is at the helm of this hunting machine, all perfectly designed to fit the person, with biometric measurements to figure the length of the canoe, the length of the paddle, the length of the throwing board. Everything was perfectly designed for this function. So starting out, these are the earliest dated, earliest throwing boards that we know of that has a pretty solid data of collection. These were collected by the Vancouver expedition in Cross Sound between 1790 and 1795, and these are in the British Museum now. There's only a few of the throwing boards that are documented, and they're all documented as being collected in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Most of the boards are not dated, unfortunately. But this puts it in a period of the maritime fur trade, when you had European and American fur traders sailing through Southeast, meeting with Alaska Natives to purchase through trade sea otter furs, and the Russians also brought Aleut and Alutiiq people down to hunt for them, enslaved them, in fact, to hunt for them in Southeast Alaska. So that brought those two groups of people together. And the trading ships were very small, in some cases barely longer than the canoes that were coming up to them, and often they were surrounded by 20, 30 full-size Tlingit dugout canoes full of people who were trading over the gunwale of the ship. And a lot of the collections that these guys made that ended up in places like the British Museum and the Peabody Museum in New England, these early 19th century collections, a lot of it is the stuff that they had in the canoes: hunting equipment, personal articles of clothing, utilitarian things, not really ceremonial. These guys were after furs. They weren't going around robbing graves very much, or making anthropological style collections. It's just what happened to be laying around in the canoes. So a lot of these things are utilitarian items. And these four boards that are in the Peabody Museum at Harvard were collected between 1813 and 1821 by an American fur trader. And the style of these, in fact, the style of all the Tlingit boards, except for one, are from the early 19th century style of carving. So we know these are old, and a lot of them are very worn. They must have been used by generations of hunters, because even though the wood is hard, all the surfaces are polished over. In fact, some of the carving is completely worn off just by handling. So we know these were cherished objects, and probably some of them were known to be very powerful as far as their ability to successfully hunt animals. Let's see. These are two of the boards from the British Museum, collected by Vancouver between 1790 and 1795. And of all 25 boards that we've located in museums around the world, only 2 of them are similar as far as the composition of animals. And these are the 2, both collected by Vancouver. And they both have the main creature is a long-beaked bird on the handle. In this picture, to the right of the finger hole, which is you see that just left of center. There's the beak of the bird is on the finger hole, and the head of the bird is at the other end, which is where the hook is that hooks into the spear. So there's the rest of the boards, the other 23 boards, are completely unique as far as the composition of animals or spirits depicted on them. This one's in a private collection. There are quite a few of these that are in private collections, and this one is from the De Menil collection that's on display in Houston. This is another one that features a long-beaked bird that's off to the right-hand side in the slide. And most of these seem to be long-beaked seabirds. In fact, there's one of the boards from the Smithsonian appears to be a merganser, because it's got a long beak and it looks like teeth in the beak. And birds usually don't have teeth unless it's like a dinosaur, but we don't think it's that old. But often in Tlingit art, mergansers are depicted with a long beak and kind of a serrated, inside the beak, a serrated surface. And so mergansers are an animal that is greatly respected for its ability to hunt sea creatures. And they're very fierce and very successful, and that might have been a reason to put one on a throwing board, because you're hoping that the power of the merganser carries over to the hunter when they're also hunting sea creatures or sea mammals. So there is a few other boards that have birds perched on one end, and then the shaft itself is relatively plain. And this one is also in the British Museum, but it was collected in Sitka in the late 1800s. And then there's this one, which features a perched bird and an unidentified creature on a otherwise undecorated throwing board. So this is one in a private collection, and it has a composition of several different creatures. Some depicted in the round and 3 dimensions, and other in the 2-dimensional form line style. And this particular one is one of the finest carvings as far as quality goes, and was probably carved by a master carver. But not all the boards are carved by master carvers. Some of them might have been carved by the hunter themselves, and they did a pretty good job, but it's not a masterpiece. I guess what the main thing was it successful, and what was the meaning of it? And that's the primary considerations. So they don't all have to be masterpieces, but a lot of them are. This one is one that may be, I'm a little suspicious about it. Somebody sent this to me and didn't identify what museum it's from, and to me the carving looks a little bit strange, and it's possible that it's not authentic. It might be a reproduction or a fake. And so I haven't had a chance to really study this one. So this might be number 26, if we can find out what the provenance is of it. Let's see. This one is this is the original, one of the originals from the Smithsonian that was scanned, and it has quite a variety of figures on it. There's a humanoid face. There's a sleeping. This one is a humanoid face with eyes closed, and that could represent a sleeping man, which is a clan crest from Sitka, or it could be a depiction of a shaman in a trance. At the opposite end of the board is another perching bird, another allusion to a successful hunter. These are two other boards in the Peabody Harvard that both have on the right-hand side, which is the end of the board that hooks into the dart, there's perching birds there. And this is a third one. This is another one that has a perched bird on the end of it. So this one is undocumented. It's in a private collection and has several creatures that could show a link to the spirit world. One of the creatures has a tongue that's sticking out of his mouth, and that's something that's often interpreted as a metaphor for communication or the passing of spirit power, and that shows up a lot in shaman's gear. This is one that is in the American Museum of Natural History and was collected by George T. Emmons in the 1880s at Sitka. And this one is the only one that appears to be a later carving. Most of these are from the early 1800s. This one could well have been from the late 1800s. And Emmons said that the Tlingits were using these in the late 1800s, but his feeling was that they saw the Aleut and Aleutic hunters that the Russians had carried down to Tlingit country, and the Tlingits saw them using throwing boards and copied them. But we know just on the basis of the age of some of these other boards that it wasn't just a recent phenomenon that came about by the Tlingits copying some of the Aleuts or Aleutics. We know for sure that it's an earlier technology. Here's another board with a composition of creatures on it, including at the very bottom, you see the finger hole there at the bottom, and there's a face with a long beak or snout on it that's down at the very bottom, kind of a U-shaped mouth. And there's another one like that. This one was literally just a few months ago. We were able to get this photo of one that's in Ireland in the Ulster Museum. It was collected in the late 1800s, but it has a similar long snouted creature at the bottom, which is on the left-hand side. And to me, it looks like a whale or a large, maybe a supernatural whale-like creature that has this huge mouth without teeth. And just noticed today, putting this show together, that the blowhole or the finger hole is in the exact position the blowhole would be if it was a whale. So possibly that's a depiction of the whale. And again, you might have something like that on a throwing board to show a clan crest, or maybe for the hunter to have some of the power of the whale in going on a hunt. This is one in a private collection that has a couple of aspects to it that are things that you see on shaman's gear, like there's at the very top there's a little humanoid that's kind of like clinging to the end of it, and going down his back is a vertebrae shown, and that's something that often shows up on shaman's gear, and another creature with an extended tongue. And this one is a private collection too, and it has on the right hand image there's a a little bit down from the top, there's a human face, and the tongue is sticking out and going all the way over the top. Again, possibly an allusion to transfer of spirit or communication. This one also has, on the right-hand side, there's a fearsome-looking creature with the tongue that comes out of his mouth and goes over the top and down the back. That's something that you do see on shamans' equipment. But it could also be, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are shamans' tools. It may just mean that that's a depiction of a spirit. And so it just shows that these are spiritual objects, not shamans' objects. And that's all I have, so I'll turn it back over to Rich.
So we've looked at how the throwing boards work. We've looked at the examples that we've seen around the world of them. And climate change is a major part of this conference. So we need to work that in here. We've already looked at ice patches, which are melting because of climate change. We need to think about climate in the last 1,000 years and what we see in the Northwest Coast. Is it possible that these throwing boards that we're looking at were actually functionally used? Well, we've just pulled out of a colder period, generally called the Little Ice Age. Obviously, warmer and colder periods within that period, but what we know from cold periods is a lot of marine resources go up, like salmon and seals. We have glacial advances. We know that seals pup out in front of glaciers on the icebergs, and might consider that this is a possible increased opportunity for hunting seals in this area. Now, right out in front of a glacier, you're going to have a little murkier water, a little more brackish fresh water. This would be the kind of place that you would probably want to have some kind of tool that puts a dart in that animal. Otherwise, you're going to lose him. Interesting archaeology done in Yakutat Bay. They found that the Hubbard Glacier has receded over the last 900 years there, and there's a whole series of sealing stations or villages that walk up the bay as the ice receded. So we know that sealing in Yakutat Bay was a really big deal over the last 900 years. Possibly were using a bow with seal arrows, or were they using a throwing board with darts? We don't know. So could this tool have been used for hunting? Scans of Shee, of the Tlingit throwing boards, show that there's little metal inserts up in the back end where at the end of the dart slot. So they've been reinforced to make them functional. So we know they could throw darts. Experimentation with the 3D printed ones, like the one that circulated, show that they're tough to use with a 6-foot dart, but with a shorter sea mammal dart, they do work fine. It's that wrist snap at the last part of the throw that transmits a lot of energy, the majority of energy to the dart you're throwing, and you can do that just fine with a shorter sea mammal dart. Some of the 25 known are longer than the one that circulated around, and so a little longer makes it a little easier. Not so much for transmitting the energy to the dart, but to kind of balance the dart. So it's a little easier to hold in your hand. That's more important for folks like you and me that don't do this regularly. If you do this more regularly, not such a big deal. Conclusion. Tlingit Shee could have been used for hunting marine mammals with short seal darts. If you go over to the to the museum next door here and look at the Anungan or Aleut exhibit, they've got a big red throwing board and a little tiny dart. That dart will work just fine in the Xi'an that you've seen here. Okay, so we've got 3D boards. Why is that important and what should we do with it? Hands-on activities for the general public, for school groups, and for culture camps are real important. It's a way for the public to grasp how things were done in the past and to better appreciate that. This is one picture from an atlatl event at the Native Heritage Center. That's Andrew Bayo, a ludic carver, demonstrating for folks how it works. Other examples of things you can post to try and engage people from the life-size mammoth made out of moving boxes and a tarp to somebody sitting in a skeleton kayak throwing at a seal. There's a hell of a story about the rhino on the left side that showed up at an event one time and I wasn't expecting it. And the thing is life-size. But it's padded on one side, and people did hunt woolly rhino, many thousands of years in the past. So it is one of our targets. And then for the, you have hunters and gatherers in any traditional society. For the gatherers, we have a large carrot, something else to throw at. Throwing board events. These are opportunities to impart an appreciation for how things are done in the past. They need to be done with functional equipment. You just can't have a nice throwing board and a dart that doesn't work at all. Both people can't then gain appreciation for the technology, and the people that are doing it go, oh, I can't do this, I'm no good at this. We did a hands-on workshop at the clan conference 2 years ago, and a guy walked up and said, oh, I can't do this. I did it at such and such an event, some time ago, and I couldn't do it at all. And I talked to people, and I knew they were using equipment that didn't work very well. And so he got up there and he threw it at the target, and he nailed the center of the target, and he went, wow. People need to both appreciate the equipment and get that sense of understanding and satisfaction that with some practice or with good hand-eye coordination, they can do it. You want to reach a preteen or early teen young guy, give him something sharp to throw. It's way better than talking at them. It's an activity they can relate to and that they remember. A lot of people have had an opportunity to throw a Xi'an. This Harold Jacobs and Michael McNulty at the Smithsonian in 2018. So the Smithsonian over time has had opportunities to throw it there in Maryland, 2017 at the last clan conference, and this year, 3:30 today and tomorrow behind the Tlingit Haida building. Come give it a try. So what's important about all this? Well, it's not whether the Tlingit Xi'an is functional or not. It's the fact that we can take and 3D print an item and actually have it in our hands, get a feel for how it worked. It's a way of connecting to our past and that we make the try. Thank you. We have a few minutes for Steve and I to take any questions you've got. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know where the Tlingit Haida building is.
That's okay. I had to learn.
Yeah, it's just if Whittier Street runs in next to this building between here and Centennial Hall. You go down Whittier Street, to the stop sign and look to the right. There's a big building. That's the Tlingit and Haida building. And just around back on Village Street is where we'll have the darting range set up. And you'll see us out there if you just go around to the back side of the building. It's one and the same. That's one of the other, and it's also the Elizabeth Peratrovich Hall. So yeah, that's right. Just like, yeah, there's Foodland and IGA and
Sir.
Yeah.
Richard, has there been any terrestrial throwers found in Alaska or Yukon?
There have not. There has been one reported. The Quadidon Sinchi, a long time ago man, found on the glacier. There was a number of items found when they did that search. One of them is a stick yay long with a hook on the end. That same tool is found, was used historically, and there are historic examples found. That's a gopher stick used for setting ground squirrel snares. There has not been a spear thrower found in the boreal forest. We have throwing boards found from wet sites and frozen sites around the Arctic coast, some going back at least 1,000 years, but none for hunting terrestrial mammals. Yeah.
Just thank you for this presentation, both of you.
Sure.
What are the types of wood that the original Sheeans are made of, and how does resin work versus making them in the actual wood that they were produced in?
Well, I don't know that we have had any technical analysis of the wood species on any of these. One of the things that makes it hard is that they've got such a heavy patina on it that you can't really see the ring structure. I think you might have to take an actual sample of wood off of it, and that's a big issue for the museums, at least, to let you take some wood off of it. Yeah, but it seems to be a very hard, dense wood. It could be something like yew wood. I think from the color of a couple of them, it looks to me like a kind of a medium reddish color. That could be yew wood, it could be maple, or it could even be like a spruce limb or something that has a really dense grain. But they seem, for the size of piece of wood it seems like it's got more weight to it than a typical regular piece of firewood, So that's about the best I could do. As far as how the plastic version compares, I think Eric has said that it's similar in weight, I believe, to the ones. I don't know that they actually compared, but they're close. And I don't know if any of the boards, do any of the boards, Rich, have flexibility? Okay, they're all
very rigid.
Okay, so
yeah.
They're all meant to be rigid, and any flexibility that there is comes from the dart itself, which actually, when you're looking at the darts flying through the air this afternoon, you'll see them just wobbling amazingly, and rigid darts don't work.
So it sounds like the resin does the trick that wood would do, because
right.
Wood is such a different property.
Right.
Yeah.
There was another question over here just a minute ago. Yes, ma'am? Is that you?
I wondered if the archaeological field research is still ongoing for those melting snowfield sites.
Yes, ma'am.
And how close they are to the Alaska border, and are any on the Alaska side?
There have been ice patch finds made in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Alaska. For 10 years, I was a Denali Highway archaeologist, and we monitored snow patches there. We found arrows. We found stone points. This last year, I just went back out with a hunter, and we found a nice antler handle with a little steel crooked knife on the end from a snow patch. We've never found any dart equipment in the Denali Highway snow patch because they're younger snow patches. In the Yukon, they've got some really long-lived ones, and that's where they're getting these 4,000-year-old darts, 9,000-year-old slotted antler point, stuff like that. Stillman's next.
Yeah, on the trailer, wouldn't you think that if the rock issue would exclude things like maple and alder and maybe even spruce, and confine the possible wood types to Pacific yew and cedar?
I couldn't say. I like the idea of the yew.
Well, none of the boards that I showed today, and in fact, none of them that we know about, are documented as being archaeological in nature. It was all, they were all acquired above ground, either through trade or theft or something like that. So there's only one. The only other throwing board that's been found on the entire northwest coast, and I didn't put a slide in, unfortunately, but it was found on the Skagit River, and it was from the mud. It was preserved by the mud. Do you remember what species of wood that was?
You know, I think that was yew.
Okay, that could that's that's within the range of Pacific yew. And that one is also decorated. It's got a large supernatural creature on it, but unlike the Tlingit ones, it has a pair of finger holes in it that you'd grip at something like this with your two fingers going into the holes. It's more like the Great Basin style from the interior. But yeah, none of the others are archaeological.
Yeah. There are a number of things, number of hands.
You asked about the wood in the Yukon. I work with Yukon Education, and we do this. I have a set of 27 darts and some cradle style throwers just to make it easier for the younger kids. But we also use it as an ADSD project with our project that skills we actually get our kids building these things and trying to propel them. So it really engages our young men and women. It's an amazing project, but we work really closely with the archaeology branch. They study the wood. They can document climate change, and they can show the transitions of wood. It also, what's really cool about what they're doing in the Yukon is they're linking our oral histories. So the year of two winters and stories like that about volcanic ash, they're linking that to the technology. So they're fully including our Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, right in the stories of how these are done. I don't know how many ice patches they're currently studying, but it's amazing. They found the only intact full atlatl dart from tip to point last year. I got to see it, one of the first people to see it. The wood was still wet. I got a call from my friend Christian Thompson, I've got something, come check it out. And they found a unique style of spear point. That's all I can say at this point. When I went in there, a big chunk of dirt fell off it as we were looking at it. So I'm pretty privy to those things, and it's exciting. It's such an incredible way. And Richard, thank you for making that strong connection. It's a direct link to our past. We don't have pyramids to visit, but we can pick up a 9,000 piece of dart, replicate these things, and use them, get kids throwing these. But this is how your ancestors hunted and worked and lived and thrived. Because we always say survived. Well, there's a little news for everybody. We didn't just survive. We were thriving there. You know, our trade routes and our technology was vast and incredible, and some of it we're still using, like our inland snowshoes. The only way we could live inland is if we didn't figure that technology out, which is fascinating history, much like the atlatl. So I always appreciate getting more information and linking it to what we're doing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, let's touch base afterwards.
One of the problems we're having in the Yukon is that with climate change and these super warm summers is that we don't have enough funding to cover the ice patches that need to be. So identifying hot spots and prioritizing them. I was asked to go in a helicopter to my traditional territory north of Tasman. We're starting to find stuff in there, like they found some evidence. Some of the stuff they're finding, for example, is the binding that they're using on the binding to hold the points on. They're now studying the compound of that. One of the things they revealed was it was beaver castor. So we're like, whoa. So our minds are going all over the place with how advanced those darts are. You know, so it's really,
we're going to have to wrap up here. We have another speaker in a minute. So tell you what, I apologize for those people that we didn't get to. I will be around, so please, if you have questions, get with me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.